Thanks, everyone. I'm really excited to be here and chat with you guys a little bit about the National Zero Emissions Freight Corridor Strategy. This is something that the office that I work for collaborated with the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation to put together, and something we're really proud of. So let's get right to it. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background just to introduce the office that I work for and some of the work that we do. I know I probably mentioned this very briefly in our last presentation, but just for a little more details about all the great work that the Vehicle Technologies Office does. Vehicle Technologies Office, or VTO, is part of the DOE Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, and it focuses on creating a more sustainable transportation sector. We do applied research and development across major technical areas that are critical to vehicle efficiency and decarbonization. So that includes both on-road and off-road technologies. It's a pretty large suite of different technologies. For on-road, that can include battery research, electrification of motors and EV charging, materials to make vehicles lighter weight, and then energy efficiency mobility systems, which looks at the transportation system as a whole, and novel materials for propulsion systems. So Vehicle Technologies Office also works in off-road technologies as well. So that can include, we have a handy acronym called DORMA, Decarbonization of Off-Road, Rail, Marine, and Aviation Technologies. So things that fall outside the vehicles that go on the roads. And we have research teams that look at how to decarbonize these kind of tougher types of off-road vehicles as well. So there's really a lot of research and development going on in all of these areas that are related to medium heavy-duty freight, off-road kinds of vehicles. And freight in particular is something that's a really high priority area. And then the team that I work on, as I mentioned before, technology integration. So we're really focused on deployment of technologies. So technologies that have already been proven in the lab or on demonstration tracks, like how do we actually deploy them in the real world and how can they be used? And we work closely with the Clean Cities Coalition Network as well. That work locally, but are supported by our national level education and outreach resources. So it's quite a lot. And also to help us, we collaborate frequently, and we also collaborated on this strategy with the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. So I wanted to briefly mention a little bit about them. The Joint Office was created through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law to assist with the implementation portion of that law. And the overall vision of this office is a future where everyone can ride and drive electric. The office provides technical assistance, information sharing to support the deployment of electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging infrastructure. They support, you may know them because they support the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, or NEVI. That's a pretty big role that they have, and they also manage the charging and fueling infrastructure, CFI grants, which we heard a bit about earlier. And they also provide technical assistance for bus deployments through DOT and EPA. So that's a kind of a broad overview of the two offices that put together this strategy. And now I'll talk a little bit about the National Zero-Emission Freight Corridor Strategy itself. So the overview of this strategy is this was an interagency initiative between the Joint Office and VTO, and in collaboration with other partners. The corridor strategy, hopefully many of you in this room have heard of it. It was published in March 2024, and the goal is to align and accelerate cross-sector investments in zero-emission medium-duty and heavy-duty vehicle infrastructure, and really encourage focused planning around this infrastructure in order to complete the network And achieving a complete network for medium and heavy duty by 2040, that really creates the conditions necessary to meet 2050 decarbonization goals. So in the context of that, it is important to note this strategy includes both electric vehicles and hydrogen fueling, and it identifies the key characteristics of zero-emission freight corridors and sets forth a set of priority corridors over time that will help the federal government strategically sequence its investments in areas where they are most needed. So that's not to say that we would consider wouldn't consider infrastructure projects that are not on a particular corridor during the time frame of a particular phase, but rather that we give additional consideration to projects that are along these corridors. So that's how we think about it there. The overall approach is to catalyze public and private investment in zero-emission freight and fully build out a zero-emission freight corridor by 2040 by prioritizing and sequencing federal investment. So really it's about identifying key factors that drive when and where zero-emission trucks will be deployed and where that infrastructure will be needed. So those key factors have really driven the mapping work that illustrated the potential expansion of zero-emission freight over time. We've converted that into a series of phases that I'll talk about in a future slide, and we look at where the zero-emission freight trucks are likely to deploy over time and where freight is moving across that network. And then this is a bit more about the authorization for the strategy, a little bit more about the language that's in the bipartisan infrastructure law. The key factors we considered included freight volume over the national highway freight network, the location and sites of ports and other intermodal warehouse facilities, the areas where policy provides a favorable market for zero emissions trucks, areas where financial considerations provide favorable total cost of ownership for vehicle emission trucks. And we also considered air quality issues, particularly in the early phases of this strategy. We also considered the recently announced hydrogen hubs and where those may be located, although at this time we really only know regions where the hubs will be located and not specific locations. So that was a factor in decision-making as well. And now we get into the 4 phases of the strategy. So the strategy separates the corridor expansion into 4 phases between now and 2040. So this first phase is now through 2027, representing the initial deployments activities to establish the hubs. The second phase is between 2027 and 2030, which begins to show the connection of these initial hubs across the major freight corridors. The third phase is between 2030 and 2035, expanding our scope of freight hubs to encompass smaller facilities and further expanding the connectivity of the entire network. And then in the fourth phase, between 2035 and 2040, we prioritize the vast majority of highway freight network to enable the near ubiquitous access to zero-emission infrastructure nationwide. And then I'll go into a bit more specifics of these strategies and some helpful maps, which I think show where these are actually located. Here's our early deployment, phase 1. We're prioritizing areas of deployment of zero emissions vehicles in areas where they're most likely to succeed in that very near term. So we're looking at the trucks that are available now, which have relatively low driving ranges, and they're best suited for more return to base sorts of operations, such as package delivery, urban regions. They're mostly medium-duty vehicles at this point in the market, mostly used in regional operations. So we considered all of those factors, and we also considered states with zero-emission truck regulations, such as California and the Northeast. which is likely to push most of the still limited supply of those trucks to those regions. And then looking at the cost of trucks and potential cost savings and operations, where would that cost be a little bit more favorable? The facilities really ended up being the largest ports and intermodal facilities, places where there's lots of freight being processed. So things like the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles in the west, and ports of New York and New Jersey in the east. So all of that resulted in the map that you see here, with those corridors largely focused on kind of population centers, port centers, lots of freight activity happening. And for scale, this represents about 12,000 miles of the national highway freight network, which is about 23% of the current national network. So that's what the first few years are focused on, is these hubs. And then in the second phase, once we have our hubs, we look at how we connect them. So the connections along the interstate highways where much of this freight moves, like the I-95 corridor in the east, I-5 in the west, I-10, I-80 that go across the country. That's kind of where we focus. In this phase, we begin seeing activity for zero-emission trucks outside of the states that have the regulatory drivers. So now we're looking beyond, California, Northeast. And the truck technology is evolving, and electric ranges we expect may be increasing by a few years from now. And hydrogen fuel cell vehicles also are likely to start coming online at this time. So this phase brings the total mileage to 19,000, or 36% of the national highway freight network. And then the third phase, 2030 to 2035, now we're expanding our list of potential freight hubs to smaller facilities. As truck capabilities increase and infrastructure expands, we'll be more likely to take advantage of zero emissions trucks. So now we're seeing some potential for long-haul trucking with both battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell technologies. More nationwide connections are being made throughout the network, and the network in the eastern U.S. fills out significantly. And now we've expanded our network to 37,000 miles of the national highway freight network, or 72%. And then phase 4, this is the complete network. We expect to have this completed by 2040. The vast majority of the national highway freight network is prioritized, and this covers about 94% of the national highway freight network, or about 49,000 miles. Interstate connections that are missing at this stage are ones that do not see much freight movement and don't really have any freight hubs nearby. So this covers pretty much all of the priority freight areas. In April, the White House hosted a roundtable on zero-emission freight infrastructure as a follow-on to the announcement of this freight corridor strategy. The intent was to summarize and highlight progress already being made in infrastructure deployment towards phase 1 of the strategy, as well as to conduct breakouts to discuss the next steps on strategy implementation. This workshop included attendance by 100 participants representing fleets, OEMs, utilities, infrastructure providers, and environmental organizations. At the workshop, panel speakers demonstrated progress against strategy phase 1 corridor deployments. Attendees made a total of 10 announcements on infrastructure deployments on the day of the event, and 171 infrastructure deployments nationwide were highlighted, representing about $1.5 billion in public and private funding. And the White House published a fact sheet on this event and outcomes as a follow-on to the meeting. So these are some helpful links if you would like to check out the strategy yourself. It is available on driveelectric.gov. The White House Roundtable Summary also is available on the White House website, if any of you would like to check this out. And I did want to briefly mention as well, VTO, my office, also funds a number of medium-duty and heavy-duty corridor projects as well. that I thought I'd briefly touch on. A lot of these projects started before the National Zero-Emission Freight Strategy, but are really strongly aligned with it. Here's a brief overview on our specific work on corridor planning for medium-duty and heavy-duty charging, fueling infrastructure. In 2022, we actually awarded a series of 7 projects through a competitive solicitation to conduct planning efforts for zero-emission infrastructure technologies along freight corridors. And these corridors were prioritized and considered as we were developing the freight strategy as well. And the DOE-funded projects basically focus on electrification plans for really heavily trafficked corridors in Northern and Southern California, Eastern Seaboard, Northeast, Southwest, much of the Midwest. And they're about accelerating the deployment of medium-duty and heavy-duty EV charging and refueling infrastructure to reduce emissions from freight corridors and the depots, ports, other facilities that these corridors service. And they also support our Justice 40 priorities by demonstrating the impacts and benefits of these freight corridors on the underserved communities, since many of them are located in areas that may be underserved, overburdened by air quality impacts. And really, we're looking at where freight is more likely to be moving along these corridors, where trucks are likely to be stopping or congregating, how far they're going, what else that means for infrastructure. The outcome for each of these projects is a plan for where infrastructure can potentially be located along the corridors to serve freight needs, while also we looked at utility side considerations, things like interconnection and grid resources, just to make sure there wasn't a conflict between those two needs. Project partners include vehicle and infrastructure industry members, vehicle fleets, state and local governments, utilities, research institutions, and community-based organizations. The objectives of the commercial ZEV corridor would be to develop these regional plans, look at both electric and hydrogen fueling infrastructure, really enable these key corridors to be ready for infrastructure deployment. So in keeping with this national strategy, these corridors also have the additional funding for implementation of that strategy. And to really quantify the effects of electrified freight traffic and have that information available to us, I think this will be really valuable as we expand throughout the country. And identify not just advanced charging, but hydrogen fueling infrastructure. So really looking at both of those zero emissions fuels to be deployed. As some additional objectives, assess the current distribution grid hosting capacity. Not much is known about the grid capacity at this time, so these will be very valuable for that. Identify hydrogen supply logistics. Now that we've identified our general hubs, how will the logistics actually be put into practice? Address the needs and interests of fleets, site hosts, other freight stakeholders, electric utilities, all of these stakeholders that come together for this project, and serve as a blueprint for large-scale deployment of regional commercial EV charging and hydrogen refueling. We do love a blueprint at DOE, so we love having that strategy in place. Oh, and I should mention also these projects, the planned completion is 2025, so that means that as the strategy for freight nationwide is going underway, we will have these projects completed in a year that should give us that blueprint to help. And then lastly, of course, we all love a map. This helps visualize where these corridors will be. So highlighted in yellow here, these are the corridors covered by the 7 projects that were funded by DOE to give you a visual representation. So again, mostly clustered in our population centers, but going out, covering important freight locations such as the Los Angeles Basin. It actually does cover the freight corridor between Louisiana and the major Texas cities. So folks here in Louisiana will benefit from these projects. And it also covers freight corridors in the Northeast going towards the Midwest. So covering our heavily trafficked areas and kind of giving us a head start on the national freight corridor strategy. And that about wraps up my presentation here. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to me, and I can certainly put you in touch with the folks that put the strategy together if you have any more in-depth questions that you'd like to ask. And yeah, we're really excited for the future of clean freight.